From the air to rail lines, grocery stores, universities, you name it. Coast to coast, we are in a wave of labor unrest. So what's behind all this job action, and could we be in for even more?
It's been grueling. This isn't like a cakewalk.
We don't want to be privatized. We're here to fight for more full-time jobs.
It seems like every other week we're hearing of workers on the picket lines pushing back.
Union power.
Things first heated up last spring when more than 150,000 federal public servants walked off the job, then thousands of port workers in BC and Metro grocery store employees in Ontario.
I'm a meat manager. On these union contracts, I'm the highest paid employee, and I can't afford to live in my own city. I can't afford to shop in my own store. It's kind of sad.
The wave of last summer kind of hit the beaches and then has receded, and then there's been another wave of labor unrest.
Just how much is tracked by Statistics Canada? Between 2017 and 2020, strikes hit a record low, just 328. But take a look at 2021 to 2024, that number ballooned to 1,111 strikes. Last year saw 745 work stoppages, more than 4 times the usual number of strikes and lockouts across the country.
Well, we've had a lot of pretty bitter standoffs in labor negotiations in the past couple of years, and that's the result of this mismatched expectations. On the one hand, we've had rising worker expectations where they're sort of feeling they're in a position to fight for more and win. And employers for their part, who have grown accustomed to the past few decades of minimal wage increases, concessions at the bargaining table. And so they're really coming to loggerheads.
Experts say many things are at play. First, inflation. It skyrocketed to a 40-year high in 2022 to 8.1%. At the same time, wages adjusted for inflation fell by 3.4%.
Workers have been falling behind because if they had the average increase, because inflation was so high, the real money that they have was falling behind. So now they're getting to the table and they want to make sure that they're getting these jobs to catch up.
The business community can see it two ways, like, hey, that's part of the job is to always ask for more wages. We get it. But the other side to it is that deserved? And right now we're in a situation which is actually quite punishing. For example, if you go look at a basket of groceries in the past 3 years, I think it's gone up something like 50 or 60%. Some things are up even higher than that. It's very, very expensive to live here.
Another factor, record high corporate profits.
A study released by Canada's Competition Bureau in June found that Canada's 3 largest grocery companies collectively reported more than $3.6 billion in profits last year.
That, coupled with the astounding difference between workers' wages and what their bosses bring home. According to a report this year by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the top 100 CEOs in Canada earn 246 times more than the average worker.
I think it's a new kind of consciousness of workers who, especially frontline essential workers, who realize the value of their labor coming out of the pandemic in ways that they didn't before. And they're looking at CEOs' pay packages and compensation and thinking, listen, if this CEO can make X amount this year and the profits of this company are going up, are at record levels, then why shouldn't I have a piece of this pie?
Despite the number of high-profile labor disruptions we're seeing, experts say we are nowhere near the record levels seen back in the 70s.
The rally at Queen's Park at least began impressively as each protest group marched behind union banners to the front of the legislature.
When a massive general strike saw workers rallying against crippling inflation, rising unemployment, and wage controls brought on by Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government. Still,
there's organizing at Starbucks happening, there's organizing drives happening at Amazon in Canada. And so I think we're in a period, and this is hard to capture in the statistics because these organizing drives haven't played out. So we could, in the years to come, look back on this period as the beginning of a labor upsurge equivalent to what we saw in the 70s.
There's no question job action is disruptive and can have immediate and widespread consequences.
We are seeing an increasing number of strikes and lockouts. We're seeing them in longer duration and kind of ongoing threats, particularly to Canada's infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure has been knocked out many times over the last couple of years. We've had major supply chain challenges, some of them, of course, due to the pandemic, but many of them due to the fact that we are right now making Canada's union legislation so union-friendly that unions are turning more frequently to the strike front.
With a federal election slated for next year or possibly sooner, both sides say they'll be watching how governments continue to navigate ongoing labor disputes.
What we're looking at is past the rhetoric. We're looking for people who put in legislation that supports workers, that will put in the changes that are needed to balance the field for workers and make life more affordable. And as quite honestly, if corporations aren't coming to the table with also that acknowledgement that they, need to ensure that their workers are at least keeping pace, but hopefully getting ahead in this time when, their profits are so high, well, then I think what we're going to see is workers kind of having enough. And that means they're going to push it and they're not going to accept substandard agreements. They're going to push for good agreements. And if that doesn't happen, the power that we have is to pull our labor, and that means getting into labor disputes.
We're not asking for Canada's labor legislation to be pro-employer. We certainly know that that unionized workers have to have a strong voice too. But the balance is missing. With a ban on replacement workers, employers have very few options left, and they feel virtually powerless in these kinds of settings. And that's one of the reasons why the federal government is having to take extraordinary action, like the order for binding arbitration or potentially back-to-work legislation if that fails. The reason for that is that we basically have created a system where we've decided that it's better for us to just push ourselves into crisis again and again, and then government will act decisively.
Each strike or work stoppage is obviously unique and equally complex. And while it can sometimes lead to inconvenience, experts say Canadians should try to look at the big picture and what all of this labor unrest means for the rest of us.
We should be asking ourselves, what's the promise of Canada? I thought coming to this country, the promise of Canada is you could come to this country and you could have it all. The average, two parents and two children could buy a house on very regular incomes. I mean, we're talking about blue-collar laborers, and that was the promise of Canada. And that promise doesn't exist anymore.